Welcome back to the Arab Tyrant Manual podcast. In this episode, Iyad and I ask, why is human rights advocacy failing so often, and what needs to change about the way we approach it? This is a high-altitude discussion on the state of activism and how it's changing at the same time as changes in the global power balance and the shift in attitudes of different governments regarding human rights protection. I want to contextualize it. We sound very harsh on activism, and I don't want this to be taken as criticism of any specific activist, organisation or campaign. We're talking about long-term trends and dynamics to which there are always exceptions. Many of these ideas are works in progress, as we mention, and we're far from having completely thought out the issue. We welcome any feedback if anyone else is grappling with the same questions. If you're watching this on YouTube, please note that there's no video for this episode. Video will be back next episode.
The huge elephant of the room is that the world order is changing, and the rules-based machinery that can, or claimed, to protect human rights is gone. All of our human rights activism is happening in a world where the fundamentals of human rights activism are changing. And instead of querying these fundamentals and coming up with new ones, we're just doing the same thing that doesn't work and wondering why it's not working.
لهم حديد ونار لهم حديد ونار وهم من القش أضعف.
Recently, I have been feeling a sense of pointlessness. A pervasive kind of sense of pointlessness, which I am familiar with because sometimes it happens when I'm burnt out. It's also like, it was also December, January in Norway. It's a very dark period of the year. And I was thinking, I thought at the time that, maybe part of this is seasonal depression. And I think it was, part of it was seasonal depression. But this sense of pointlessness, as it lifted, as the seasonal depression kind of lifted and things became, we're past the darkest part of the year. And I don't really feel depressed anymore. But at the same time, that sense of pointlessness still continued to be. And the other day, I was kind of journaling, doing some integration, and I realized that sense of pointlessness is not psychological. It's not about me. It's about that whenever I think about anything in our field, whether it is, let's say I'm browsing my Twitter timeline, for example, and I see, for example, this person doing something about, I don't know, signing a petition for this, or giving a prize to this person, or trying to do advocacy on this issue. I felt that nothing of this excites me, but for a very specific reason. I feel like this is, like I said again, kind of like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It does not go down. First of all, it's not being done at a scale. It's not zoomed out enough to actually capture the size of the problem, and it does nothing to tackle the systemic issues that are really plaguing our field entirely. So I realized that it's not just me. It's not just that I'm depressed and I feel like it's very strategic. I actually feel like a lot of this work needs to change. And we have been discussing this for a very, very long time. In fact, I realized that, let me check the date of the tag on, in my Rome database. Yeah, so essentially I started using this, talking about paradigms of activism in Rome in May of 2020. And I remember that, in fact, some of our first concept notes for Kawakibi Foundation, when we were seeking funding in 2020, also we're all about, how this is a different kind of, like, we basically want to champion a different model of activism.
Yeah, the idea was much less well-baked, but it's always been there in some form or the other. And a couple of weeks ago, you sent me this article, which kind of gets to one part of it really well. It's about this thing that the author calls folk politics. And he basically says, this idea is that, so all politics begins in the immediate, where actors work on social change in their immediate environment, but folk politics refuses to leave that level behind. It refuses to become indirect or to look at the abstract and the conceptual. It only wants to work on the immediate, because it's easier to accuse greedy bankers of moral failure than to rationally analyze the details of the capitalist economic system. It's easier to donate against world hunger than to think about the actual root causes of where world hunger comes from in the first place. And it's always in reaction mode. So you have this kind of era that we all instinctively feel like we're living in, where the world keeps getting worse and we just keep reacting to it. Like the right of politics shifts the Overton window and we respond and defend.
I feel that we're coming to a head over here because, yeah, we have been talking about this for a long time. I think that we started talking about this in 2019, actually. I personally had a very turbulent 2019, not to get into it. But by the time we're into 2020, late 2019, early 2020, we started thinking, okay, what does this mean? How does this work get carried out now? But I think that in a certain way, a lot of people were thinking, maybe even us at some level, we were thinking that maybe, okay, Trump is going to leave the White House, and then things are going to even out a little bit. I mean, we knew that, we're actually entering a new phase in geopolitics and history, etc. And the way that we do our work has to change. We knew this, whether it's Trump or Biden, we knew this. But I think at some level, we thought that things are going to get a little bit easier. And I think maybe a lot of people were playing this waiting game, thinking, okay, maybe Trump is an exception. We knew that this was not true, but a lot of people were. They're thinking Trump maybe is an exceptional period, and then after that, we're going to return to some sort of normalcy. Add to that the fact that the pandemic added a lot of another flavor to this, especially that, this is what I feel right now. I feel like the actual troubles are going to start after the pandemic. I think that 2022 maybe could be the year in which many things open up, and there's a lot of economic growth in some parts of the world where the pandemic is well managed. Maybe we'll have another variant sometime in the year, but I think that little by little we're going to basically be coming out of this.
So I've been spending a lot of time on economic research lately, and the consensus in economics seems to be that there's a massive wave of economic crises just beyond the horizon, because you basically have like runaway inflation happening right now because of the amount of money that was printed to get countries through the pandemic, and the true impacts of that on prices, asset prices, basic goods prices hasn't really been felt. Not to mention the impact of that on states which were already in a bad economic situation. Like if Western countries are worried about this, then imagine what's going to happen in Egypt, where they've been in Saudi Arabia, where they've been basically giving surprise tax bills to companies because they need to make the books balance somehow. Or Egypt, where they're basically jailing or arresting businessmen and forcing them to pay a ransom effectively to get back out. And it seems like over the last 2 years, people have forgotten that these countries were close to the precipice already before COVID.
No, but I think there's something else that's going to happen, which is that the economic recovery is going to be extremely uneven, not only among countries, but also within countries, and is going to expose a lot of social problems. The other day I was just reading this about how, there was a selection, I think, of a few billionaires, and there was some research about how many trillions of dollars they got richer during the pandemic. So inequality is getting worse, and with inequality comes social upheaval. And the thing is, our ideological landscape, but also our geopolitical landscape, and also like everything that we've built, like everything that's been built before has been built under the assumption of certain rules and norms that don't exist anymore. And things are about to get, they're about to get more complex, not less complex. And I think that's something, I don't know why I felt this energy now. Maybe because we had already developed a strategy for Kawakibi, and we were about to, we're basically working on, our project manager basically just started to put these on a schedule for the year. for this year and the next year to start, implementing these as projects. And maybe in the early, in our early work in 2020, even, for parts of 2021, I think a lot, like our engagements and our coalition work with a lot of other organizations, we kind of felt out of place. And I think this is something you felt a lot,
Yeah, I mean, the whole activism sector, like we've said so many times, just has this unfitness for purpose about it. Like so many of the things so many people spend so much energy on just feel like they're done for emotional catharsis because they're not actually going to achieve what they're, ostensibly being done for.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting diminishing returns on many things. So I started to think. Recently I've had like a meeting, an extended meeting with someone who's leading one of the most important human rights organizations. He's a leader within that organization. I don't think he's the one on top here in Norway. And we had a free-flowing discussion about how things have to change, and how there are certain fields that we're kind of obsessed with these fields because I think they're part of the future, and there are certain projects that are part of the future. And then it struck me that maybe, all of these ideas should be put in some kind of format that between the two of us and maybe within our team, we should be discussing this more. I don't know how big this is. It's basically just the big question, or the big topic is, what does activism look like in the new world? How is the activism paradigm changing with the shifting geopolitical landscape? How do we defend human rights past 2020 and into what seems like a turbulent next decade? What is valid, what is not valid anymore, and what's going to be valid? If we want to be valid, if we want to be powerful in 10 years, what should we be investing in today? If we want to be able to defend human rights in 5 years to 10 years, what is the capacity that is required for us today? What is going to be working? What is going to be not working, and so on. I don't know if we talked a lot about the reasons, but I don't want to get into the reasons right now because I think we've already discussed this. What are those geopolitical changes? And maybe we'll get into it. I don't know. But the idea here is, I thought maybe between me and you, we should have like this kind of side project. It's not really a side project because it's not side. It's actually quite important. But, kind of a small project where I would, write something about this. And then you have a week, for example, to comment. And then after that, I have a week to comment back, and so on. And we develop this into maybe we also bring in a few people also into the conversation. And eventually what we do is that this kind of, over the course of, let's say, a month or 6 weeks or 8 weeks or so, that develops some kind of map or some kind of outline saying that this is the field. This is the field of inquiry that we're going to be looking at. And I don't know I don't know how big I don't know if this is kind of like an article or a book. I don't know if it's a podcast or a series of podcasts. I don't know what the size is going to be. But I think it's just very important. I think if we write it, well, I don't know if we're going to write it or record it. I think it's going to be very seminal, not only for us, but for other people in the field.
Yeah, I don't think the form matters so much as doing the actual inquiry. The ideas are foremost. But the core of this, and what we've been, complaining to each other about for a long time, is that the field of human rights as a whole for a very long time has over-indexed on appealing to international authorities to care, when they've been shown time and time again that authorities don't give a shit about human rights. There's, I don't know if it's actually true, but it's a popular quote attributed to Einstein that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results. And we're just doing the same thing.
To be fair, the real problem is that the same things used to work. Of course, they didn't work for everybody. I'm Palestinian, I can tell you that. But they used to work for at least some people some of the time.
I'm not sure if they
and-
used to work so much as we used to not hear about the ones that didn't work so much, because now everybody has a platform.
No, we did, and these people, of course, I'm, anger is part of the Palestinian experience. But what I said is that at least the public narrative about these, at least the public narrative among the people in the West, is that human rights work actually gets results. And there was a certain toolkit that was developed. There were certain rules on how to use this toolkit. And if you want to work in the organizations, there's a certain skill set that you have to get. And this was, and again, after social media and stuff, the toolkit changed a little bit, but it's more or less was a new twist on old techniques anyway. I think what we're facing right now is completely different from anything else. And a lot of things that used to work don't work anymore. And of course, I've expressed this in the book, basically how the liberal world order never cared about us at all, even in the first place. And we're suffering before it. It was built upon our own, our dispossession. And then it's, now that it's crashing, we're the first to suffer as well. But, besides that, I don't want to talk about the geopolitical context for it, but, what I want to do really is look at specifically our own work, Kawakibi's work, and kind of talk about why we pick these things, what's the implication for others in our field, etc. So I started in December I started this tag in Rome, which is separate from the previous tag, which I started in May of 2020. It was more about critiquing the old paradigm than building the new one. It was more about saying, okay, this is what doesn't work, rather than saying these are the tools that will work. So now this is different, because now basically this is I'm kind of coalescing a lot of stuff that we've been talking about for a long time, but into something that looks more as not only a strategy for us, but something that can be shared publicly, saying that this is our view about why certain things that we're doing right now, and we're part of the toolkit for a long time, we should abandon them because they don't work. And these are new tools that we have to actually get very, very skilled in using, because they will work.
So what have you got on that list?
So I'm going through I'm going through this chronologically, starting from the first entry. And I thought that we should mention four things that are already part of our strategy and already part of KF's long-term capacity building and investment. One is blockchain. The second is monetization as a stream of income. Monetization / social media, because we go together. And then there's targeted campaigns and narrative management, which is, I kind of described as Cambridge Analytica for good, but also the narrative management thinking that goes behind, the strategic narrative management thinking that goes behind it. And really explaining the relationship between narrative management and power, because in the end it's about power. It's basically the big topic here is that this is a paradigm of activism that is based upon power building, rather than appealing to powerful institutions to act on your behalf, because they don't give a shit and they won't. And even if they wanted to, they can't. I realized also that I've kind of become.
So was there a fourth one?
No, I think I put monetization on social media as two different things, but it's actually monetization / social media. But I think there's more, because these are incomplete notes. What I started doing is that I started creating a section within my own template, my daily template in Rome. And what I did is that I'm like, during your regular day, in your regular browsing of social media, why don't you take this sense of pointlessness, let's say, or this sense of frustration, and just comment. When you see something and it's like, okay, this is frustrating, why don't you just take it, paste it, and comment on it? Like, why is this frustrating within this context? Why do you think this doesn't work? And what is the alternative? I'm yet to actually go through it and read it all together. I think maybe at some point. I actually scheduled time next week to do this. To kind of what do you say? Like I scheduled an hour next Tuesday ahead of our call, because on Tuesday we actually have a standing call, where I thought, okay, maybe I can actually spend an hour, put this together, write a blog, send it to Ahmed, so that ahead of our call, when we have our call, maybe we discuss it a little bit.
So you mentioned 4 areas, but I want to zoom out to like the ideas behind them or the principle that leads to the area. One of them to me is just dispensing with incremental gains. The idea of incrementalism in human rights doesn't seem to be working. I don't know, maybe someone will argue strongly against this and say it's done a lot of good and it's better than nothing. But I think that incrementalism is a way that you're taught basically to be less intolerant of the status quo. And we do want to be intolerant of the status quo because it's intolerable, and we want radical change, not incrementalism. So we're not looking at things that can make the human rights situation in the world 0.1% better over the next 10 years. We're looking for things that make a totally revolutionary change. That's where the whole Bitcoin thing comes from, because it's a radical disruption of the economic system.
A conceptual way of looking at what you just described is, what do you say? What's his name? The guy who wrote, who talked about the structure of scientific revolutions. He wrote a book about it.
Kuhn.
Yeah. And I think he was writing about scientific theories and how one scientific paradigm displaces the next. But then we can apply this to this as well. We can apply it to any paradigm shift. That paradigms break and then shift, etc. I think I actually did a thread about this a few years ago, which I was very proud of, and then we didn't really do much with it. But I think maybe I should take a note here that explaining paradigm shifts is part of this.
Yeah, so one principle there is radical, not incremental. Another is, I'd say, a very radical focus on independence of our work. Because when you talk, like the social media stuff is just a means towards monetization, and the monetization is just a means towards nobody being able to tell us what to work on and what not to work on. So
keep in mind that independence here is a step towards interdependence, because again, you want to be independent of bigger agendas because you want to have your independent income, but at the same time you want to work in coalitions and you want to work with a lot of people because this is bigger than one organization.
Okay, so maybe what I mean instead of independence is self-reliance, and another piece of it is sustainability.
It would be strategic independence, but I'm not talking strategic independence for the organization, for a single organization, but strategic independence for the movement.
Yeah, and sustainability is connected to that.
In other words, we will still be dependent on our, brothers and sisters in the community. But collectively, we should not be. We should be calling our own shots.
Yeah, and then the third principle that immediately occurs to me is embracing new tools because they have potential to be revolutionary, and that means embracing technology, basically, which is some of the most impactful activism that I've seen in the last 5 years has been people who've embraced tools. Like the thing that's most impressed me about Amnesty, even though we think of them as a very old school, old paradigm of activism organization, is actually that they have this tech lab, and they quickly adopted the capacities, or they built the capacities in order to be able to check phones for Pegasus. And that's had a really massive impact in protecting activists as well as exposing the people going after them.
Yeah, this has become a must, of course, and it is interesting because we need to. It's not enough for us to simply because exposing is not enough. This is the thing. We have to take it a step further. So on the list of tools, I would also add tech. We have to actually develop our own tech, which is, as you know, like we have been talking about this a lot, as that Kawakibi is looking for tech, like basically to get into tech investments as well. So basically develop our own tech in certain areas. But getting back, I mean, I think it's going to be a little bit of an unstructured because I'm going over notes and the notes are not really thematically organized. But I realized that I kind of get annoyed when people, smart people, take up positions in international institutions, in like especially American institutions. I feel like it's a cop out. I feel like, can't you see? You're smart enough to see that these systems aren't working. And I understand. I mean, within the American context, I think there's some people think, these institutions are failing or these institutions are threatened. So maybe we need good people in them in order to to preserve them. But I also think if you're really, really smart, you need to be investing in the new world and not trying to preserve the old one. I mean, of course, I'm not saying the old one should not be preserved, but we need some kind of balance over here. So it actually.
Sorry, go for it.
I mean, it just feels that it's conservative and not progressive. What really is progressive is investing your energies into building a new world rather than investing your energy in holding together a world which is already crumbling.
So that's joining legacy institutions that you mean?
Exactly, yeah.
So something kind of connected to that, which one of the things that I've found very frustrating when it's not done, and I find inspiring when it is, and something that we've been trying to keep in our minds, is centering our own people, kind of connected to decolonizing, resisting Eurocentrism or Americacentrism mostly in our current world. But the way even we do activism tends to center the US and Western governments, and to an extent that people are confused and shocked when they ask us about policy. Like, I remember someone asked you about policy, and you basically once, and you said, like, I don't care, it's not my job to make your policy for you. I've told you why it doesn't work, now you go fix it.
I mean, it goes beyond that, because I actually don't think that there is the political will exists to even implement the policy. You're asking me for pie in the sky. You're saying, what policy should I implement? Do you think I believe that this policy is actually going to be implemented? I don't. I don't think that the political will even exists. And so I feel like it's a waste of my time. It's a waste of my energy to be thinking about this. And again, my job is not to fix Western foreign policy. My job is to center my people. Again, I mean, they're the ones who are being targeted. I'm not saying that nobody should be working on this. Again, I'm not, just like I'm saying, I don't mean that nobody should be trying to preserve certain institutions which are valuable. I'm saying that a lot of our energy should go into something else. Not everybody should go, and certainly I don't. My team, I don't want my team to be involved in that. I also realize that there's some kind of selection bias. Many activists get into the field because they've been targeted in ways that create a short-term goals. So, for example, you could have someone whose family is in prison, family members are in prison, or there's their activism becomes focused on this target. I need my family member, I want my father not to die in prison. I want my brother to be out of prison. I want to know what happened to my mother. This creates a short-term bias in the movement on certain. Of course, I'm not saying that these people don't care about the movement. They do care beyond that. But what I'm saying is that there is a sense that progress means that we have to hit these goals. So it cripples your ability to think strategically, long-term or generally, because you have specific goals.
Yeah, so we said this is a selection bias because the field disproportionately attracts people who have been targeted directly and therefore have a short-term need. But at the same time, we recognize that it would be uncompassionate to expect these people to think in a different way when they have such an extreme need. So we're thinking about how to diversify the field rather than how to somehow fight that or undo that.
But I'll push back a little bit, because I actually think that in the new world, we will be actually less likely to succeed in specific goals, because the new world sees less leverage. It sees us having less leverage because we're shifting from kind of a unipolar world into a multipolar world, into a world in which non-Western powers, many of them authoritarian, the other discussion why so, but a lot of them authoritarian. You simply don't have influence with them. I mean, I see, for example, so many Iranian opposition accounts, and they also frustrate me a lot, because a lot of them, they're on and on and on about how why should America allow this to happen? Like there was one today about, free the hostages, etc. I'm like, do you think America even has the leverage with Iran to free any hostages? Do you think that if it had the leverage, it wouldn't actually apply the leverage? It's not a matter of simply that they can't, that they don't want to. It's that they can't, even if they wanted to, they can't. So we have less leverage on certain achieving certain goals, and so we have to zoom out. So our strategy has to change, because in that case it's not really a matter of freeing in this particular individual, but rather I don't know, maybe a political settlement or political movement where we free like 100 prisoners in a certain kind of arrangement, a certain exchange with the regime, even though we know the regime is terrible, and long term we have to continue to be fighting it. But I think that we have to be willing to think about what we cannot do, even though it's painful. It's very painful to think that there are certain things that we can't do, and there are certain people we can't help. There are specific people we cannot help. But I think it's important for us to be honest in our inquiry, to say that this is terrible, but also in this, the tools that could have allowed us to achieve this don't exist anymore. They don't work anymore, and so we don't have an ability to do this anymore. Of course, you mentioned, this is also the selection bias also means that a lot of community members are likely to be traumatized, and trauma itself creates a short-term bias.
Yeah. So what else is there? Other effects within this?
So see, zoom out. For a long time, I feel like a lot of activism was complaining and whining to an indifferent world, trying to humanize ourselves to this world in the hope that it'll act. And I think that so many people are still stuck there, especially those who work within the context of the US and the UK, because the US and the UK had an outsized influence on a lot of institutions. A lot of human rights work is becoming invalid, and a lot of people aren't even aware of it. It's sort of like a frog getting boiled slowly. I felt this when I met a bunch of people who I hadn't met since the beginning of the pandemic. If you remember, before the Omicron wave, there was a bit of optimism about things opening up and stuff, and we were thinking, that now we're able to travel, we're able to meet people, and I did travel a bit, and I did meet some people, including people here in Norway. And I felt like, my consciousness of my work has shifted so much between 2019 and now. And there was this frustration because I felt like so many people are where they are. And I'm like, don't you see that everything has changed and what you're saying doesn't work anymore?
Yeah, the frog being boiled in water does make sense there, because if you haven't actually been taking a look at the big picture, if you zoomed in on a single issue, it just seems like stuff's getting worse, but you don't realize that, it's not the tree moved, it's the tectonic plate moved.
Exactly. The glacier. The Western-dominated world order was contradictory. And there's two ways to look at it. Either we look at it as hypocritical and cynical, that they knew that it was contradictory and they still acted like it isn't. Or something that you mentioned before, we see it as inept. That it's not so much that I think we had this conversation before. This is not so much that it was built to be hypocritical. I think at some level it was, but also there's also a bit of ineptitude there, like an inability to see, an inability to have a global view on things. It's not just a matter like even now we're talking about the pandemic, for example, and how we're going to be hit by one variant after the other because the vaccination rates across the world, because a lot of governments basically are trying to fight the pandemic as if it's a national problem, but it's a global problem. The same thing happens with climate change. We're going to have more climate catastrophes, because it's again a global problem, and we're dealing with it at the level of the national government. It doesn't work. The fact is, this is also hobbled by the fact that this is a multipolar world, and a lot of the countries that have to come together to fix this are not even friends. They might be really terrible regimes, such as the Russian regime, the Chinese regime, etc. But somehow we have to be able to develop institutions and develop ways to work on global problems. So a lot of this, when I look at it, I'm like, okay, at some level, it is cruel that a lot of Western countries have achieved like 80%, sometimes 90% vaccination rates, and they're giving the third shot. I just got my third shot here in Norway, while the vaccination rates in poor countries are abysmally low. Some people, most people in poor countries haven't even gotten their first shot. And then we're going to have another variant and another variant and another variant because we're dealing with this as a national problem. And at some level, I feel this anger, and I feel, okay, this is hypocritical and this is cruel. But at the other level, I'm thinking maybe it's actually inept. Maybe it's actually that we lack the tools. We don't even know how to do things globally, how to act globally.
And that there's nobody who's actually incentivized to act in that way. So I'm a big fan of Hanlon's razor, which you just mentioned, which is never attribute to malice what can be adequately explained by incompetence. I think that's generally a great principle to have through life. But we basically have, if you really think about it, a global political order in which there isn't really anybody who's incentivized to think about the well-being of everyone, and there isn't really anybody who's incentivized to think about the well-being of people on the very long timescale. Like the people who we empower are politicians who are thinking about the next election. Like if you have a really forward-thinking politician, he's maybe thinking about the election after that. Why would you expect that person to be, making radical plans on climate change, which may potentially be painful in the short term? Their entire incentive structure is to minimize pain in the short term.
Interestingly, the global institution or the global organization that actually managed to act globally are actually corporations, if you think about it. That's something to look into, I'll say.
There's a whole thing happening right now about ESG criteria, environmental, social, and governance, being like criteria for investing in the big funds, which is pushing a lot of corporations towards like being more environmentally friendly and things like that. And I've even seen CEOs and managers making this kind of convoluted logic that, okay, we know that we're because they're working within a system. They can't change the system, so they're trying to work within it. So they're saying, yeah, our legal, what do you call it? Our legal mandate is basically to maximize returns for our shareholders, but we can't maximize returns for our shareholders if we destroy the planet. Because the maximum return for our shareholders is if it's going forever. Therefore, we have to do something.
That's the thing, because I think you found it here. Because if you are an investor, you're looking for a return on investment, and you're willing to wait. If you are a patient investor, you might be looking for a return in 5 to 10 years, and you want continuing return after that. Meanwhile, if you're a politician, you have an election in 2 years. And so that kind of creates a short-term bias there.
Kind of ironic that we've basically concluded the opposite of everyone else, that you can probably get better governance out of corporations than politicians.
I mean, of course, this is it's a provocative idea that we still have to look into, because I don't think corporations are going to save the world. I think in many ways they're part of the problem, but I think there's certain truths at the middle of this that maybe we have to dive into and figure out.
Well, maybe it's not that you get the best governance out of corporations. It's that even with the most benevolent politicians, even the greenest part of the left, you're dropping them into a context in which they have to think about the next election, or they won't be in position, and therefore you've limited what they can do.
So it looks like this is not really about how well corporations work, but how bad politics works. But it also could be that corporations have a very simple motivation. They're out to make money. Meanwhile, politicians have much more qualitative, at least self-declared goals, and that can be, that can create more confusion.
I guess also corporations are dealing with a more educated average constituent, whereas politics over the last few decades has been more and more a race to the bottom and the lowest common denominator. Like, it doesn't matter how good your policies are if you can't ultimately control the media, you have the floor wiped with you.
I mean, zooming out a little bit, talking about the Western-dominated world order, I think that talking about this, the historical context of why did we get a Western-dominated world order? This is part of this work. But regardless, the order is going away. These countries, Western countries, are no longer able to dictate order. They can't. They don't want to. They're mired in their own shit and their own dysfunction, and they're stuck in old ways of thinking. I've actually been thinking that, part of this maybe what I can do is dig up my own threads on the topic, like figure out certain words like reform or world order, institutions, etc. Maybe that can be part of the query over here.
Yeah, so one of the things that stood out to me from that folk politics piece, and which I think connects a lot to our media strategy, the reason we're doing this in the first place, is that one of the reasons people run to the immediate and neglect the systematic is because there's so much complexity in the modern world, and complexity is difficult and scary. And probably one of the most impactful things we can do is help people through that complexity. Like, we have the luxury to be able to take the 10,000 foot view and look at the world in a systematic way, and we should be trying hard to pass that on to the people who can't spend that much time on it.
Yeah, but keep in mind that many political leaders today are actually deepening the ignorance here. I was like in the morning when I'm like cooking to have my meal, I normally like watch, either I listen to a podcast or a documentary or something, but sometimes also I watch news. And about a week ago, a little bit more than a week, Blinken, the U.S. State Secretary, he was like talking about the whole crisis with Russia, and he said something like, "We can't go back to a world of spheres of influence. That was a recipe that led to conflict and world wars." But the fact is that we are going back to it. I mean, get with the program. I mean, it's you can, because you can't dictate order anymore. But I think I mean, of course, I was ranting. I wrote some notes about this. I was ranting, but then I realized that, what? Let's focus here. We will not be able to campaign for specific tactical outcomes. We will not be able to go for narrow, short-term specific objectives as much as before. So I feel like there are levels to this, because I feel like legal challenges are still useful. Legal challenges, strategic litigation, etc., because they depend upon the legal system. And the legal system is almost, it's, at least in Western countries, which continue to be important to the world. We're not saying that they are going to be insignificant. We're just saying that there's going to be like a global evening out. The legal sector is normally independent. So you don't have to go and convince a parliament or a government that, this guy's a torturer and he should be convicted. Sometimes you have to pass some laws, for example, universal jurisdiction laws, etc. But in the end, I think legal challenges will continue to be important. Next level becomes single country advocacy, which of course requires you to convince a government or convince a parliament, do advocacy work. But then, this works within that context of that country. You can maybe change policy in a single country, and then, if it works out, you can roll it into more countries. But again, how far can one country do? That's the thing. You can work on local issues, certain local issues, but you can't fix the entire world from there. And even then, that country, that parliament, etc., has to be both willing and able. And increasingly, it's neither willing nor able. The third level would be, I'm trying to achieve something on a multi-country front. We're like kind of like the world democracies or the Western world or the liberal world. I don't think it will happen for a generation, if ever.
There is some success on that front. Like you could see the Magnitsky sanctions as a limited success on that front, because he managed to get it very widely applied in a few years.
Yeah, but sanctions as a whole are going to be, that's the thing. Sanctions as a whole.
That's another important point, that sanctions are a failing paradigm.
They're a failing paradigm, except in very specific cases. In other words, you have to be kind of forensic about this. You have to think, okay, who am I trying to target, and what can I take from this person that is valuable? The Magnitsky sanctions, if you remember, worked specifically. They started against Russians with a very specific context, which is that Russian elites like to spend their time in Europe. But then, if you try to use that, for example, in China, the Chinese don't like to spend their time in Europe, and so it's simply less effective against them. And then they have a big internal economy. It's not going to it's going to work in some cases, but not in others. And also, you sanction them, but also there's a whole other monetary system being developed on the side, which is cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, etc. Which is, again, you can sanction them in one area, but still that's not going to take away all of their wealth or their ability to continue to do business. We mentioned corporations, and I feel like power is actually shifting towards large corporations who run the internet. This is another area which I think is also important. Having influence with large corporations that run the internet, and having them having some kind of relationship of dependency where they depend on you for certain things is becoming more important than government advocacy. It also means that we should have to invest in our own tech, run our own tech companies. The internet is a place to build power. We should build our own platforms. We should, with monetization, community. And it also means that our narratives, if we want to unlock the full power of the internet, our narratives have to go beyond identitarian boundaries if we are to win. So that's another area, basically, the internet, and specifically the corporations that run the internet, because we're not at Web3 yet. We still have a centralized, what do you say, an internet with centralized power.
Well, if you believe in Web3 at all, because that whole area is very fraught.
I don't think it's going to. I think it's a good idea. I don't think we're there yet, and I think it will happen, but I don't think it's going to happen overnight. One other reason why advocacy, just changing topics here. One other reason why advocacy is failing has to do with the very fact that the world order is changing. So states are having to prioritize. See, this is the thing. States before could talk about values, and they talk about, we have to uphold these values, etc. But now, because the world order is changing, it is creating anxiety, geopolitical anxiety across the world. And this is forcing many countries to prioritize their geopolitical interests and to switch to pragmatism and realpolitik, rather than talking about values and institutions, etc.
You could flip that on its head, because we started this conversation by talking about the way, this alternative narrative of how slavery was eradicated, which was it became no longer economically profitable with the Industrial Revolution, and when it was no longer necessary, then the tide turned against it. In the same way, you could arguably say here that talking about values was an easy thing to do, when actually being pro certain values was also, at the same time, could further your imperial ambitions. Because
your soft power.
Yeah, the US could talk a big game about liberalism and freedom if that meant bringing countries into, out of this bipolar world of the Iron Curtain and under the US's umbrella, part of the empire. Now that's no longer the case, and trying to stand up for values is seen as squandering power rather than gaining it, because you're fighting very powerful adversaries.
Regardless how many times, for example, Biden and the world's centrist liberals, speak about how we have to preserve values and institutions, we just have to acknowledge that the geopolitical landscape is changing, and maybe we should, mention a little bit about how it's changing for context. But not on this conversation, but maybe in our eventual paper somewhere. But I think maybe we should just acknowledge, things are changing. People are countries are becoming more anxious, and because they're anxious, it's understandable that they're going to prioritize geopolitical interests because they are anxious. We have to there is a return of geopolitics. For a while, I think that we took geopolitics for granted. So there's a return of geopolitics. I also think that boycotts are going to continue as a tool. Boycotts are going to continue to be important, especially if we use them to build community and network and hire volunteers and build kind of stable long-term coalitions. So it's not just the boycott movement.
Basically as a tool for organizing.
Exactly. So it's not really about recruiting in order to act, but acting in order to recruit. It's a way for us to build coalitions and to activate people, etc. And it's also a way to activate and build influencer networks, because a lot of boycott campaigns kind of depend or, really need kind of like big influencers on social media, etc., to take up the cause. So I think boycotts are still going to be an important part of the of the toolkit. But then we will be doing this understanding that it is unlikely that the boycott is going to actually. I mean, the way that we measure success has to kind of change, because instead of talking about we have to stop this horrible thing from happening in the world ever again, to this boycott managed to achieve some results and raise some awareness, but also it built an amazing coalition and activated so many volunteers who can be part of the movement. It's we have to look at this holistically. Sanctions, on the other hand, like I mentioned, are going to be less effective. We talked about this, mainly because the West runs less of the world economy, but there's also alternative monetary networks, etc.
So something that's standing out to me here, and it's a common thread through all of the different methods that we're mentioning, is basically having a theory of change and understanding the causality behind the methods and strategies that you advocate, as opposed to doing things because it's the way they've been done before. Like the way things have been done before is to advocate to governments and international entities. It's to push for legislation and sanctions, etc. But if you look at those things from a first principles lens today, you see that A, they have a low likelihood of succeeding because of all the factors stacked against them, like the geopolitical interest of states, and B, even if they do succeed, they aren't very effective.
Keep in mind also that here we're talking about all of this is talking to people who aspire for power. We're not talking about people who are already powerful. If you're already powerful, there's no need for you to use our methods or to change your methods. You're going to be invested in using your power in the traditional way that has always worked and kept your system in the first place. So the battle shifts from trying to wrest control of the system from them, who already run the system, to trying to build an alternative system because the existing one is crashing anyway. So we're trying to find alternative ways to fight, and we're trying to kind of topple the system that they already use because it's crashing anyway. I mean, I don't know if we have to like actively undermine it, or it's undermining itself. So essentially, this piece of work, when we're talking about activism paradigms, is not relevant for people who are already powerful, because these are the guys we're fighting, and there is reason to believe that they're not going to be investing in the same thing that we're investing in, because it's a far shorter journey for them to simply double down on what's been working for them. Maybe there's a bit of optimism there. The other day I was like browsing, and there's this guy who's an Emirati advocate, and he's talking about the UN should pressure the country into releasing a prisoner. The UN cannot pressure anybody. The UN itself is a playground for dictators. Whether or not one country can be pressured to release a prisoner depends upon a few things. How dangerous is releasing this prisoner for the regime? What will his life post-prison be like? Is he going to cause more trouble for the regime? What precedent will it set? How serious is the pressure or pain upon the regime? Like is it really
leverage,
suffering?
Basically.
Yeah. What leverage do you exactly? So this is where we have to focus. I mean, when we're talking about releasing prisoners, this is what we have to focus. We cannot just write a petition for the UN. What are they going to do?
But even like that takes a special kind of either naivety or delusion to think that A, the UN even has an interest in pressuring to release prisoners, because there's no evidence that they've ever cared. And B, that they have the ability to do that even if they wanted to. What are they going to do? Invade you?
I mean, this is what kind of tells me that campaigning for individual prisoners based upon quote unquote human rights will not work. But we will have to use something else there. We need a much bigger and broader coalition in order to create enough pressure with the potential for serious escalation. Reputational damage, targeted media campaigns, boycotts, legal measures, targeted sanctions, elevating the reputation of the imprisoned. Like looking at recent cases like the Lujain case. Lujain Al-Hadoul case was exceptional because, first of all, she was very well connected, and also the siblings coordinated with others. It was a coalition effort. And even then, it had limited success because Lujain is kind of under house arrest in a way. The perfect campaign is one that will not only hurt the regime but also offer it something valuable that it can say, okay, this is a way out for us, and we'll let them go so long we do this. So we have to think in a much different way, much more strategic way. I mean, I threw out an idea in my database. I'm like, okay, let's say that the people released are going to live in a neutral country for a period of 5 years where they will not engage in political activity. For us, it'll be like a healing period. They're going to undergo therapy and healing, etc. And this will be guaranteed by a certain country. So they're kind of like saying, okay, they're out of prison, but at least there's an arrangement with a kind of sunshine clause that says that they're not going to give us trouble for the next 5 to 10 years. 5 years, let's say, and during this period, where the hope is that there's going to be some kind of political settlement, So it has to be more transactional than based upon human rights, unfortunately. Just an idea.
Yeah, all of this is basically arguing for seeing things through a totally new paradigm, which I don't think a lot of people are ready for. But again, you have to focus on the edge cases where you do find a convergence of people who are ready to think that way and try something very different.
I also noticed that some people, because they're aware of things are not working anymore, this is creating a kind of backlash. I saw a series of tweets recently about people who are dissing raising awareness. They're like, raising awareness doesn't work. I understand people are frustrated because the things that used to work aren't working, but it doesn't mean that we should throw out the baby with the bathwater, basically, or be short-sighted. It's not that raising awareness doesn't work. It's not that it stopped working. It's that the world is more complex, so the chain of causality needs to be fully explored. Raising awareness doesn't work if you think that making a video about something will fix it.
Again, it's part of having a theory of change and an actual strategy and a theory of causality, because raising awareness, okay, and once there's awareness, then what? And sadly, too many people's thinking actually stops there. They haven't gone beyond that. What happens when there's awareness?
It's not all or none. It's not like, because a lot of people's like, why are you excited about this? It's not going to fix everything. But that's not all or none. It's kind of, we have to understand what is the connection, what is the relationship between narratives and power, because it's not direct. But taking it back to activism, this is, as the case with everything else in our toolbox, the reason why it's become so problematic to have specific targets is because the tools of pressure themselves are less targeted. They're becoming more strategic, and so we have to think about it.
And underlying all of this is a sense of prioritization, because as a community of human rights activists, we have a very limited amount of effort and limited, political capital, and we have to spend that in ways that expands the political capital and achieves results. You have to spend it well, basically, and you can't spend your energy raising awareness without an idea of what comes next.
Exactly, which goes back to your point about having a theory of power. Like, what are we doing here? I'm also kind of annoyed.
I think that's the thing, really. Like right at the bottom of it is, like, sometimes when I'm scrolling through social media and I see stuff, I think, guys, what are we doing here? Like, what next? Well, why are we doing this, and what do we do after this? Is there something after this, or are we just going to be doing this forever until we die?
Yeah, recently there's a lot of excitement, for example, in Germany about a sentence for an Assad, a torturer, basically, a colonel who used to work for Assad. And I completely understand that people want to see accountability and closure. And this is a sweet moment for them, of course. But at the same time, let's face it, it's not going to fix Syria. And it won't even fix accountability. It will bring comfort to some people, but it won't stop the crime of torture in Syria by Assad or anywhere by anyone.
So on that, I disagree a little, because I think if you're looking on a very grand timescale, what it actually does, it's not about Syria at all. What it actually does is go towards entrenching the principle of universal jurisdiction a little bit more, maybe towards a future someday in which it's very natural that these people would be tried anywhere the moment they step foot out of the country that they did the crime in, because that would be a great thing for human rights.
No, but I do agree with you. Basically, what it means is that it is not about this specific case. Again, it means that we have to think systemically, and we have to think generally rather than specifically, because in the end, this means if we have enough of these cases, maybe it will mean that if you are a torturer right now, you know that eventually you're going to be caught, even in 10 years, in 20 years, you're not going to get off the hook. It's going to catch up with you sooner or later. And it means that you're going to have a very limited life, because otherwise you'll have to kind of live in you have to hope that your dictator never dies. And you have to kind of stick to your town, because if you go outside, if you cross up, if you travel, etc., you're going to be caught. But yeah, I mean,
that's optimistic. I think it's really for a future generation in which there will be that kind of accountability.
I guess the huge elephant of the room is that the world order is changing, and the rules-based machinery that can or claimed to protect human rights is gone. All of our human rights activism is happening in a world where the fundamentals of human rights activism are changing. And instead of querying these fundamentals and coming up with new ones, we're just doing the same thing that doesn't work and wondering why it's not working. One more thing that I wanted to mention, which is important for our work, because this is something that we're deeply invested in, is criticizing dictators without offering a vision, which there's a lot of this all over the internet. Even if everyone agrees with you that this ruler is incompetent and shitty, it won't automatically make you a competent visionary. You have to demonstrate vision and competence and ability to bring people together.
Yeah, but I don't necessarily think it's harmful to normalize that. I think it's good to normalize, the entire citizenry of a country having outright contempt for their ruler, even if they can do nothing about it.
Well, yeah, but we've been doing this for a long time. I mean, this is part of, again, this is general work, and people are going to do it anyway. But I think it's very critical that we understand that it's not enough. We have to offer an alternative vision somehow. We have to demonstrate, competence somehow.
Yeah.
In very specific ways. I also kind of are getting really annoyed. You mentioned this, like how US-centric a lot of activism is. And this kind of made sense to me during the Trump years, because the stakes were very high. And I thought there was a reason why we had to be kind of America-focused, because we need, Trump was a threat to everybody. But now that Trump is gone, Americans are becoming increasingly shrill and annoying with their constant bickering and petty partisanship and shit that nobody cares about except for them. It's not only that the US is more polarized than ever, it's that the US is no longer the center of the world. Remember that interview about the Bitcoin, was it the crypto interview? The guy who was interviewed by American.
Do Kwon, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure that we'll talk about this in a Tarbouche episode soon. But the idea is that they're no longer the center of the world. So what happens there is less important and more irritating. We used to care because we had to. Now we don't care because we don't have to. This is a symptom of US decline.
Do you remember me telling you a couple of years ago that I actually really resent the space this takes up in your attention? That I don't care about US politics. I don't want to care. For a while I went through purging my timeline, because it's not useful to me or to the world that US politics is on the brain of everyone.
To be honest, we have to query this again, because there are certain parts in America which are important for the global zeitgeist. Silicon Valley, computer game industry, Hollywood, right? Tech industry, etc. But not really the politics. That's why I'm saying, in 5 to 10 years, it is more important for us to have a close and strong engagement with those organizations that run the internet than it is with the government.
Well, even better is to become one of those organizations which runs the internet.
Exactly.
And the best way of doing that is to join free software movements and help decentralize it.
That's exactly true. If I want to kind of wrap this up and tell you from our list of projects what I see, we have to work on a large scale. Large scale economics is what? Our Islamic economics project. Large scale politics is what? Arab Spring Manifesto and radicalization. Large scale history is what? The decolonial book. The decolonial history of the world. Large scale meta politics is what? It's looking at disinformation and also the manifestos, the vision projects. Large scale activism is what? It's this conversation. Large scale debates. I don't know what that looks like. What else? I mean, we have to keep building this list.
Yeah. Well, we have large scale trauma recovery and healing.
Social, basically social healing. That's Shifa. I don't know where, basically, I think our blockchain and Bitcoin work comes also under large-scale economics.
It also comes under sustainability and self-dependence.
يا مصطفى يا كتابا من كل قلب تألف